Good morning. It is Thursday, February the 24th, and this is The Drill. Welcome to the butchers, bakers, and candlestick makers out there. I'm Ron, your host, and the only true conservative in the United States today. So today, after the Daily Declaration for Spiritual Warfare, the Pledge of Allegiance, and the Star-Spangled Banner, we will have, foreign policy, no free lunch, and the moral equivalent of war. All that and more when I come back. Thank you. Ineffable Creator, who out of the treasures of thy wisdom has appointed 3 hierarchies of angels and set them in admirable order high above the heavens, and has disposed the divers portion of the universe in such marvelous array. Thou who art called the true source of light and supereminent principle of wisdom, be pleased to cast a beam of thy radiance upon the darkness of my mind and dispel me from the double darkness of sin and ignorance in which I have been born. Thou who makest eloquent the tongues of little children, fashion my words and pour upon my lips the grace of thy benediction. Grant me penetration to understand, capacity to retain, method and facility in study, subtlety in interpretation, and abundant grace of expression. Order the beginning, direct the progress, and perfect the achievement of my work. Thou who art true God and man, and livest and reignest forever and ever. Amen. Thank you. And now the Daily Declaration for Spiritual Warfare for February the 24th. My power and might will scatter the enemy. My power and might will deliver you from your enemies. I will be a fortress for you against brutal people who attack you and want to kill you. Do not fear when they are ready to attack. I am the Lord God, all-powerful, and I will be your protection. Why are you so frightened when they plan their nighttime attacks with curses and confidence that no one can hear them? Have I not told you that my mighty power will make them tremble and fall? Don't you know? Haven't you heard? I am your eternal God, creator of the earth, and I never get weary or tired. I give strength to those who are weary, so that you will be strong like an eagle soaring upward on wings. Psalm 59, verses 1 through 12, Isaiah chapter 40, verses 10 through 11, and verses 28 through 31. Prayer declaration. Father, you have given to me the same great and mighty power that you used to defeat my enemies. Your power raised up your Son from the dead, and I have access to that power to overcome all my enemies and live victoriously through you. Your glorious power will give me patience and strength to be victorious over Satan's evil intentions. Amen. And that was the Daily Declaration for Spiritual Warfare for February the 24th. Thank you, thank you. Who is the true conservative? He is the person that has the courage of his convictions and is confident in what he knows. He is the person that understands that cultural conservatism is more important than political conservatism. He is not selfish, but minds his own business. He acts like an adult. He is patriotic and uses common sense. He expresses what he knows and does so with certainty. He makes judgments, refuses to speculate, speaks clearly and definitively, and is not afraid to say no. He's open-minded, asking why rather than why not. He is consistent, credible, and influential, not ashamed of his existence, unafraid to learn or correct his mistakes. He is a normal American, and he's better than the socialist. He's a better friend, father, brother, family member, and a better person, period. You have to know that. If you don't know with every fiber of your being that being a true conservative is best, then you're wasting your time. Thank you, thank you. Now, there's no free lunch. To clear, cultivate, and transform the huge uninhabited continent which is their domain, the Americans need the support of an energetic passion. That passion can only be the love of wealth. So no stigma attaches to the love of money in America, and provided it does not exceed the bounds imposed by public order, it is held in honor. Alexis de Tocqueville. It would be easy to take this out of context if one does not have at least a surface-level familiarity with the great de Tocqueville. What is being celebrated is not an idolatrous love of money, quite the contrary, but rather the world-transforming uniqueness of American aspiration, the pursuit of a higher quality of life and pursuit of happiness, in no way divorced from the transcendent truths and moral requirements of man as created beings, removed from the burden and falsity of guilt, sit at the foundation of American exceptionalism. And that was, there's no free lunch. Thank you, thank you. And now, the moral equivalent of war. The modern world is fueled by decayed sea scum. For 500 million years before man first walked, plankton died and sank to the bottom of ancient oceans, to be covered by shifting sand and decomposed into gunky sludge. The mysterious process of geology encased the sludge in underground cavities, preserving it as a viscous liquid, oil. There it waited, quadrillions and quadrillions of tons of goo, for men to find it, imagine uses for it, and then, through the even more mysterious process of mass hysteria, terrify themselves that they were running out of it. 60 years, almost to the day, that Woodrow Wilson asked Congress for a declaration of war against Germany, April 18, 1977, another Southern Democrat appeared on the nation's television screens to declare the energy crisis, quote, the moral equivalent of war, unquote. The stark fact, President Carter intoned, was that the oil and natural gas we rely on for 75% of our energy are simply running out. Each new inventory of world oil reserves has been more disturbing than the last. World oil production can probably keep going for up to another 6 or 8 years. But sometime into the 80s, it can't go up anymore. Demand will overtake production. We have no choice about that. And things were only going to get worse. If we do not act, then by 1985, we will be using 33% more energy than today. Within 10 years, we would not be able to import enough oil from any country at any acceptable price. Carter intended to act. The new president was sending to Congress a comprehensive plan for taxing foreign oil, regulating the price of domestic oil and natural gas, subsidizing alternative energy, rationing fuel, and regulating the wattage of toaster ovens and the temperatures of office buildings. Carter understood that his plan would be controversial, but unless Congress accepted it, he warned, we will face an economic, social, and political crisis that will threaten our free institutions. Who could doubt him? By the end of the 1970s, the jig seemed more or less up for the American way of life. The number one nonfiction bestseller on the New York Times list in the fall of 1978 was Barbara Tuchman's book about the calamitous 14th century, A Distant Mirror, which offered readers the grim consolation that things had been even worse during the Black Death. The era of growth is over, and the era of limits is upon us, a prominent economist told readers of the Times. It means the whole politics of the country has changed. All problems have become distributional. We already see it in a whole set of divisive tendencies, blacks versus Jews, men versus women, and the whole debate over energy policy. What Americans worried about energy producers gloated over. The industrial world will have to realize that the era of their terrific progress and even more terrific income and wealth based on cheap fuel is finished, the Shah of Iran said in December of 1974. They will have to find new sources of energy and tighten their belts. Back in a minute. Thank you. The oil and gas shortage of the 1970s inspired a vast collective end-of-the-universe feeling among Americans and Europeans, a certainty that the good times were over, that the last trump had truly sounded. In 1972, a conclave of economists and businessmen led by an Italian social scientist published The Limits to Growth, a book whose title would give a slogan to the decade. The book itself was silly. It simply plotted the inflation-driven upward trend in the price of raw materials of the previous few years and extrapolated it unthinkingly into the future. What was brilliant was the byline the publishers chose for themselves, the Club of Rome. Rome, with its triple associations of the ruin of a great republic, mystery and infallibility, and revelation and apocalypse. Rome was a word that resonated in the American mind. Had the publishers of The Limits to Growth called themselves the Club of Glasgow or the Club of Hamburg, it's doubtful they would have achieved equal success. The clubmen of Rome avoided that blooper, and when gasoline ran short at American filling stations in the summer of 1972, millions of ordinary Americans began to wonder whether those conclaved anonymous wise men in the eternal city might not know something. They didn't. The energy shortage was not inflicted on man by nature, but by his own illusions and mistakes. It had nothing to do with geology and everything to do with economics. It was created by government interference with the marketplace, prolonged by government's attempts to alleviate it, and vanished the very instant government stopped trying to cure it. As M.A. Edelman, an oil economist who in the hysterical 1970s correctly predicted the energy bust of the mid-'80s, had elegantly put it, oil reserves are no gift of nature. They are a growth of knowledge paid for by heavy investment. The world's oil is not like the world's supply of an old master's paintings. There are precisely 33 of them, and if one were to be destroyed, only 32 would remain. The world's supply of oil is more like a supermarket supply of canned tomatoes. At any given moment, there may be a dozen cases in the store, but that inventory is constantly being replenished with the money the customers pay for the cans they remove. And the more tomatoes that the customers buy, the bigger an inventory the store will carry. That may seem to fly utterly in the face of common sense, but it corresponds to the facts. In 1930, the United States possessed proven reserves of some 13 billion barrels of oil. Those 13 billion barrels were the stock with which the country fought World War II, energized the post-war consumer boom, and fueled all those cars idling in traffic jams in high school documentaries about the energy shortage. 60 years later, how much of the 13 billion barrel reserve do you suppose was left? The answer? In 1990, the lower 48 American states, omitting Alaska and Hawaii, had proven reserves of 17 billion barrels of oil, 25% more than in 1930. The same calculation can be performed for the Persian Gulf. In 1975, in the darkest days of the energy crisis, the Persian Gulf was authoritatively reported to contain some 74 billion barrels of oil. This was, Americans were ominously told, only enough to fuel the world for a few more decades, whereupon everyone would freeze in the dark. After two decades of frantic pumping, how much of that 74 billion was still there? Answer: as of 1993, 663 billion barrels, 9 times as much as 20 years before. But for oil supplies to keep pace with demand, prices must be permitted to move freely. This, the American leaders of the 1970s could not bring themselves to tolerate. When the Arab oil embargo struck in October 1973, President Nixon quickly named William Simon, a New York financier, as his energy czar. As Simon recalled in his memoirs, Nixon granted him absolute authority. I was to decide everything and to decide it rapidly. He equated our energy crisis to the kind of problem one has in wartime, and he likened the job he was giving me to that of Albert Speer in the Third Reich when he was put in charge of German armaments. Nixon told the cabinet that if not for the power that Hitler had given Speer to override the German bureaucracy, Germany would have been defeated far earlier. That might seem a rather unnerving parallel, but in 1973 it came quite naturally. A conservative like Nixon might praise free markets to the Republican faithful, meaning that he disliked excessive taxation and interference in business. In an emergency, however, even conservatives reverted to the tools and techniques of the 40s: rationing, controls, planning. As a sign of the time, the nation's debate topic set for the country's high school students in 1976 was resolved. An international organization ought to allocate all scarce resources. Nixon's 1971 price controls had almost immediately been imitated by other industrial countries like Britain, France, and Italy. While most of those controls were soon lifted or relaxed, controls on the price of oil were not. Controls never work well, and controls on the price of internationally traded raw materials function especially badly. Unfortunately, the Americans of the early 1970s had a hard time recognizing oil as an internationally traded commodity. Even in 1970, the United States still produced more oil than any other country. 87% of the oil Americans burned was drawn from American wells. Maybe the price of oil pumped in Saudi Arabia and sold in Italy lay beyond the reach of the U.S. president, Americans thought, but surely the price of oil pumped in Texas and sold in California could be set in Washington. And back in a minute. Thank you. As we now know, it cannot. Queues began appearing at American gasoline stations in the summer of 1972 as Nixon's controls dampened production and discouraged people from figuring out ways to use the stuff more efficiently. The queues stretched out even farther in the summer of 1973. Controls were the main reason that the Persian Gulf, which had provided less than 20% of the world's oil in 1960, was providing 36% by 1973. With the price of gasoline held artificially low, it made short-term narrow sense simply to pump from the fields already in production. If controls made the oil cartel of the 1970s possible, Vietnam made it thinkable. Until the late 1960s, oil-producing governments had good reason to worry about how the Western countries might react to any attempt to put a thumb on their energy windpipe. The CIA in 1953 toppled an Iranian prime minister who had attempted to nationalize that country's oil industry. Mexico had nationalized its oil industry in 1938 and had been cut off from foreign technology and capital. A British fleet still patrolled the Persian Gulf. More immediately, the oil-producing countries did not have their hands on the oil switch. They owned the oil, yes, but they had leased the right to pump it to foreign multinational companies. If they ordered the companies to halt pumping, it was by no means certain that the companies would obey. After 1970, however, both those anxieties troubled the oil producers a lot less. The 1970s were the heyday of third world state ownership. Zambia, the world's second most important copper exporter, nationalized its mines in 1969. First place Chile followed after Salvador Allende took power. In his 1975 year-end television interview, Canadian Prime Minister Pierre Trudeau, a man who so admired the third world that he apparently aspired to have his country join it, announced that the free enterprise system has not worked in more than 30 years. A report by the Organization of American States on the 10th anniversary of the Alliance for Progress recommended that the United States reconcile itself to a socialist path for Latin America. Why should oil producers feel bashful about imitating these distinguished precedents? There would be much more moaning in the 1970s by Arab governments and their many paid and unpaid sympathizers in the West about the supposed injustice inflicted by the oil multinationals upon the oil-producing countries. It is hard to see much merit to the case. In 1970, about 80% of the difference between the cost of producing Middle East oil and its contractual price was pocketed by local governments. It was the oil companies that found the oil companies that invented the technology that brought the oil to the surface, oil companies that preserved and extended the useful lives of the fields, the oil companies that built the pipelines, refineries, and docks that brought the oil to market. The only contribution of locals was to have had the good luck to have parked their tents atop a raw material that Western ingenuity had found uses for. Still, few human delusions are quite as universal as the conviction that one is underpaid. And when the opportunity arose to correct the situation, the oil producers pounced. In February 1971, Algeria nationalized 51% of the French oil concessions in the former French colony. It seized the gas pipelines as well. Compensation was promised at a rate to be determined by the Algerians. A nervous pause, but France did not retaliate. Libya expropriated the British petroleum concession in December 1971, again with compensation to be settled unilaterally. Another pause, but again no retaliation. Audacious Iraq was the first to tweak the United States. It seized a U.S.-owned concession in June 1972. A very nervous pause this time. But once more, no retaliation. Back in a minute. Thank you. Well then, it was safe. In a March 1971 interview with the columnist C.L. Sulzberger, President Nixon said, "I seriously doubt if we will ever have another war. This Vietnam is probably the very last one." Between 1968 and 73, the proportion of college-age youth who described themselves as willing to fight to defend America's national interest dropped from 54% to 34%. The proportion willing to fight to maintain America's power in the world dropped from 35% to 23%. In July 1971, the Senate voted to repeal the resolution passed in 1955, authorizing the president to use force to defend Taiwan from aggression. American power was ebbing, especially quickly in and around the eastern Mediterranean. Libya's new dictator, Muammar al-Gaddafi, ordered the American Air Force base in his country closed in 1969. Malta expelled NATO naval forces from its magnificent harbor in the summer of 1971. The British fleet in the Persian Gulf was called home at the end of that year. At dawn on October 6, 1973, the Jewish religious holiday of Yom Kippur, the armies of Egypt and Syria invaded Israel. Taken by surprise, Israel's armies retreated, and for a few days it seemed possible that the Arabs might make good their perennial threat to snuff out the Jewish state. But the tide of war quickly turned. Within 2 weeks, Israeli tanks were nearing the suburbs of Damascus and Cairo, and an entire Egyptian army was surrounded in the Sinai Desert, dependent on its Israeli mercy even for its water. Indignant, Egypt and Syria's oil-rich patrons announced an oil embargo of the United States and the Netherlands and sharp reductions in their total production. Frenzy, pandemonium, hysteria gripped the oil markets for the next 30 days. The price of oil rocketed from $3 a barrel to $12. State governments across the country asked consumers not to put up Christmas lights to save fuel. The state of Oregon banned decorative and commercial lighting altogether. Mike Mansfield, the leader of the Democratic majority in the U.S. Senate, and David Rockefeller, chairman of the Chase Manhattan Bank, called for a national gasoline rationing program. Senator William Proxmire of Wisconsin explained in a near hysterical national television address, "We need it now. It would provide some gas at present prices to everyone with a car and enough heating oil to keep from freezing in every home." Nixon rejected that advice, but in an address to the nation on November 25, 1973, he proposed the next closest thing. He announced that he would ask Congress for authority to control all fuel shipments. In the meantime, he was asking refiners voluntarily to concentrate on producing heating fuel and filling stations to refrain from selling gasoline on Saturday nights or Sundays. More than 90% of the nation's 220,000 gas stations patriotically honored the president's request, provoking massive weekday lineups. Congress granted Nixon complete control over the nation's fuel supply on November 27th. At this, the United States was escaping lightly. Britain, Germany, Switzerland, Denmark, and Norway banned driving, boating, and flying on Sundays. Street lamps were dimmed across the European continent. Factories slowed, fuel deliveries to private homes slashed. Sweden rationed heating oil as well as gasoline. The Dutch voted prison penalties for anyone who defied the restrictions on the use of electricity. Britain's trade unions chipped in their inimitable way. As the country reeled from the oil embargo, the coal miners went out on strike, and the railway workers followed, disrupting fuel deliveries to demand higher wages. In a message to the British people, Prime Minister Edward Heath warned, "We shall have a harder Christmas than we have known since the war," and implored his fellow citizens to heat only one room in their homes. Back in a minute. Thank you. The shaken governments of Europe decided that the Arabs were the new masters of the earth, and anyone who wanted to keep driving had better truckle to them. In January 1977, French immigration officers intercepted a disembarking passenger on a Beirut to Paris flight. He had flown into Charles de Gaulle Airport on an Iraqi passport under an assumed name, but French police had been tipped off to his true identity. He was Abu Daoud, a close associate of Yasser Arafat and the author of one of the most horrifying of the decade's many terrorist outrages, the massacre of the Israeli Olympic team at Munich in September of 1972. The arrest was a rare and welcome triumph for anti-terrorist law enforcement, but soon something disquieting occurred. Strange, unsourced stories appeared in the newspapers under Paris datelines. The French government was furious at its police, who had, it was said, failed to inform the political authorities of their intention to arrest Daoud. Iraq, Libya, and the Palestinian-Libyan organization protested the arrest, contending that Daoud had been traveling to a funeral of a PLO comrade and was therefore entitled to a diplomatic immunity. The French hastily rebuffed a West German extradition request, claiming that the required forms had not been filled in properly. Then, before the Germans could amend their request, they slipped Daoud onto a plane bound for Algeria and whisked him out of the country. He had spent all of 4 days in jail. The message could not have been clearer. France was scared. One of the 5 nuclear powers of the world, a permanent member of the UN Security Council, dared not bring a killer to justice. France was not alone. European police forces apprehended 50 suspected Arab terrorists. Of those 50, only 7 ever saw the inside of a prison. 36 were released in response to threats, direct or implied. At the behest of the oil states, the PLO's leader, Yasser Arafat, was invited to speak from the UN's rostrum in 1974, the first and only man to address the General Assembly with a holster on his hip. Although frantic last-minute negotiations persuaded him to leave the gun it normally contained at home. In 1975, on, as it happened, the 37th anniversary of the Nazi Kristallnacht, the UN General Assembly voted by a 70-35 margin in favor of Resolution 3375, declaring Zionism a form of racism. Daniel Patrick Moynihan, America's representative at the UN, resoundingly condemned the resolution. The United States, he says, does not acknowledge, it will not abide by, it will never acquiesce in this infamous act. The chairman of the oil companies, however, would from time to time deliver speeches suggesting that it would be wise to do so. On the other hand, the country was not ready to take the alternative step of trusting its energy future to the market rather than the goodwill of the sheikhs. Instead, William Simon and his bureaucrats drew up comprehensive plans to allocate the nation's supply of price-controlled domestic oil among its millions of clamoring users. It was an impossible job, and in the end, the controllers simply assigned each state the same proportion of the nation's total fuel supply that it had used in 1972, the last normal year. So if Massachusetts consumed 4% of the nation's heating oil in February of 72, it got 4% of the smaller amount available in February 74. In states where the population was stable or shrinking, the allocation was more or less adequate. Where the population was growing fast, California, New Jersey, Georgia, Northern Virginia, motorists were obliged to line up for 2 and 3 hours to fill up. The American Automobile Association reported that 20% of the nation's gas stations had no fuel for sale in the final week of February 1974. Fuel ran shortest at the end of the month, when the allocations were drawn down. In the fastest-growing Southeast, 36% of stations lacked supplies. Violence erupted on the highways in December 1973 as truckers launched a 2-day strike to protest what they regarded as an insufficient allotment for their industry. In Ohio and Pennsylvania, striking truckers fired guns at trucks that did not honor the strike. Non-striking trucks were blown up by bombs in Arkansas and vandalized at truck stops elsewhere in the country. The more glaringly controls failed, the more truculently Congress demanded they be tightened. President Ford, a much more committed free marketeer than Nixon, proposed one decontrol measure after the other, but the enormous Democratic congressional majority swatted them down. At a joint press conference held in July 1975, 3 Democratic presidential aspirants, Senators Ernest Hollings of South Carolina, Edward Kennedy of Massachusetts, and Henry Jackson of Washington, savagely denounced Ford's attempt to free oil prices. Decontrol would inflict economic chaos and catastrophe, warned Hollings. It would produce no additional oil. Kennedy predicted only higher prices, interest rates, and unemployment. By proposing decontrol, Jackson said, Ford was working hand in hand with the major oil companies to push the price of oil up and up and up. Back in a minute. Thank you. But even as Hollings, Kennedy, and Jackson were speechifying, the oil crisis was subsiding. Higher prices, as they always do, curbed demand and called forth new supply. In 1970, the average car on the road got 13.5 miles per gallon. By 1985, average car mileage had risen to 17.4 miles per gallon. The business pages filled up with reports of new finds in Mexico and the Spratly Islands, in the North Sea, in the oil sands of Alberta, and in Wyoming. The inflation-adjusted price of oil arched back to earth. Between the beginning of 1974 and the end of 1978, the price of an ounce of gold more than doubled, from $75 to $200. The price of a barrel of oil, meanwhile, held constant at the $12 mark. If the oil crisis was ebbing, however, the energy crisis was not. Not content with immobilizing Americans, the energy controllers were now freezing them. The price of natural gas in the interstate market had been regulated back in the 1950s, and the inflation of the 1970s had left it dangerously out of whack with reality. In fact, even to call it a price was wildly over-optimistic. 20 years of hard bureaucratic toil had produced an awe-inspiring jumble of prices that ranged from 4 cents per 1,000 cubic feet to $1.50, depending on the vintage of the gas, the location from where it was extracted, and the market into which it was sold. This was not a regime calculated to encourage anyone to go out and find new gas. And by 1976, America was burning up natural gas faster than explorers were replacing it. 237 trillion cubic feet of proven reserves on the country's books in 1974 shrank to only 203 trillion in 1978. As usual, the failure of one battery of controls only convinced the controllers that still stricter controls were needed. Those now pressing to turn natural gas price regulation over to OPEC while arguing the rhetoric of so-called deregulation must not prevail. The 1976 Democratic platform exhorted, let's try that again. Those now pressing to turn natural gas price regulation over to OPEC while arguing the rhetoric of so-called deregulation must not prevail, the 1976 Democratic platform exhorted. During the 1976 campaign, Jimmy Carter condemned decontrol of either natural gas or oil as disastrous for the American economy. As president, he repeatedly promised to veto any energy plan that did not include permanent controls on the price of natural gas. Carter's certainty over the country's dwindling gas reserves had nothing to do with price controls on natural gas, propelled the country into a fuel crisis worse, if possible, than that of 1973-74. The winter of 1976-77 was a cruel one throughout the Midwest and Northeast. After 31 consecutive days of below-freezing weather, Chicago was struck by vicious blizzards that ripped the windows out of high-rise buildings. Temperatures plunged to minus 100 in Minnesota. The governors of New York and New Jersey declared states of emergency. Ohio's Governor James Rhodes led a 15-minute service on January 29, 1977, to beseech God to relieve the storm. In the midst of the storm, the heat went off. Midwesterners cranked up the gas, and the gas did not come on. Schools shut. Homes went chilly. 10,000 factories closed, adding 1.5 million to the rosters of the unemployed. The next winter, 1977-78, was even harsher. New England was struck by the most devastating snowstorm in the region's recorded history in February 1978. 50 inches of snow, 110-mile-an-hour winds. New York City was whacked with the worst snowstorm in a decade, and then 3 weeks later with the worst since 1947. Meanwhile, another killer blizzard ravaged the Midwest, dumping 31 inches of snow on Ohio at the end of January in what Governor Rhodes called the greatest disaster in Ohio history. At least 60 people died in the Northeast from the weather, and more than 100 died in the Midwest. Again, the schools and factories closed, and homes went cold. The situation was desperate enough for Americans to consider almost anything. And that was the moral declaration of war from the book, How We Got Here, the 70s. Thank you. Who is the socialist? He is the man that seeks consensus. He is subjective, petty, and small, taking everything in life personally. He's outrageous, boring, and rude. He pretends to be a leader and a change agent. He pretends that he's your friend. He is sly, cunning, and deceptive. He dresses, acts, and speaks like a slob. He's informal and terminally unique. He is childish and pretends that he knows nothing. He has no conscience and pretends that might makes right and that the ends justify the means. He's impulsive and rationalizes his behavior. He's deterministic, blaming others for his mistakes. He's skeptical, demanding that others solve his problems. His unreasonableness and irresponsibility make him a bad role model, bad father, brother, family member, friend, and a bad person, period. So if you think that you can be friends with a socialist, think again. Thank you. This is Ron, your host, the only true conservative in the United States today, bidding adios to the butchers, bakers, and candlestick makers out there, reminding you to be honest, to be smart, to be beautiful, and to remember that the left has no authority, no power, and they can't win.